Mr. Mearsheimer, for your very interesting insights. I made some notes, but you described what will happen if things continue as they are. But what if you today had the ability to guide Europe right now? The war in Ukraine has shown that Europe's geopolitical weight has declined significantly. Do you see any chance of restoring that? What would your recommended course of action be in the current situation? I realize this is quite a short question, but the answer can be quite broad. Thank you.
Well, I certainly think from Ukraine's point of view, and I've been arguing this for a year and a half now, from Ukraine's point of view, the best thing would be to get on an airplane, go to Moscow, and work out a deal with Putin, where you accept the fact you have lost those 4 oblasts plus Crimea, that you can't be in NATO, you can't have security guarantees from the West, and you will not build a military that threatens Russia. And do everything you can, if you're Ukraine, to make sure the Russians don't take much more territory. If I'm a Ukrainian, my greatest fear is they're going to take Odessa, they're going to take Kharkiv, and a handful of other oblasts as well. And if I'm a Ukrainian, I want to prevent that. Furthermore, if I'm a Ukrainian, I don't want this war to go on because the end result is that more Ukrainians are going to die. I have been arguing for a long time that this is the smart strategy. Now, people will say, is this a good outcome, the one that I'm describing? No, it's a terrible outcome. What I'm suggesting Ukraine do, and what I'm suggesting the Europeans support the Ukrainians in pursuing, is a terrible outcome. But it is the least bad outcome, because the alternative is the war continues, the Russians take more territory, and they kill more Ukrainians, right? And they have a greater incentive to turn Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state, right? So I think the best alternative is to do that and for the Europeans to support them. But it is almost impossible for me to sell this argument. Hardly anybody wants to hear this argument. I find this hard to understand because I think it's just commonsensical. I think when you look at what's actually happening in the war, where things are headed, it makes sense to do what I said. And there are some Ukrainians, by the way, who accept this line of argument, but they're greatly outnumbered by the Zelenskys of the world. And certainly here in Europe, that kind of argument doesn't work. So I think the war will go on, and it will end up as a frozen conflict. At some point, the Ukrainian military forces on the front line will be unable to continue the fight. And then the only interesting question is how much territory does Ukraine lose? And then because of Europe's deep commitment to remaining attached to Ukraine and bringing Ukraine into the alliance or giving Ukraine security guarantees, I think that for as far as the eye can see, you're going to have big trouble in Ukraine and in terms of European-Russian relations.
All right, next question. In the back.
Professor, would it be right if I would call this moment in 2008 the big Spain moment of Russia? I mean the Kennedy crisis, the Cuban crisis. Is that to be compared or is it different?
Well, the Cuban Missile Crisis bears a marked similarity to what happened in Ukraine in one very important way. You all know that we in the United States have the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine says that no distant great power is allowed to come into the Western military, into the Western hemisphere, and put military forces, its military forces, in the Western hemisphere. And if you think about what happened in 1962, the Soviet Union put missiles in Cuba, right next to the United States. And by the way, when the deal was cut between Khrushchev and Kennedy, Kennedy insisted, of course, that the missiles be taken out of Cuba, which is what happened. And the quid pro quo was that Khrushchev insisted that we take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, because the Jupiter missiles in Turkey were right on the Soviet Union's border. The fact is that great powers do not like other great powers coming great distances up to their doorstep. And what happened with regard to Ukraine is analogous to what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just to take this a step further, because it's very important to understand what happened in the Cold War with regard to missiles in Europe. It's quite clear that the Reagan administration was pursuing a first strike capability in the 1980s. You all know President Reagan got elected in 1980, took office in 1981. He had an administration that was filled with hawks. Most of you probably don't appreciate this, but at the time, the Soviet Union and the United States had massive nuclear arsenals. And there was no way they could use those nuclear arsenals to fight a nuclear war without basically ending life on Earth because of nuclear winter and assorted other phenomena, right? So what the United States was very interested in doing was launching a decapitating strike. We wanted to be able to decapitate the Soviet arsenal. It was a splendid first strike in the form of decapitation. And many people viewed the Pershing and ground-launched cruise missiles that we put in Europe as excellent decapitating weapons. These are missiles that are right up on the Soviet Union's doorstep, okay? The Soviet Union went away, replaced by Russia. What the Russians really feared was that we would put missiles in Ukraine. And those missiles in Ukraine could be used for a decapitation strike. This is why the Russians were so upset with the ballistic missile defense systems that we put in Poland and in Romania after the Cold War ended. You understand, after the Cold War ended, the United States put ballistic missile defense systems in Ukraine and Poland. But the problem is that those defensive systems can be used for offensive purposes. In other words, you can put missiles into those defensive systems that can strike Russia and could be used for a decapitation strategy. So when you talk about bringing an alliance, right, that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union up to Russia's doorstep in Ukraine and putting missiles there that might be used for decapitation, the parallels with the Cuban Missile Crisis are quite marked. And you know how we reacted in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And unsurprisingly, the Russians reacted the same way.
Okay, next question, and please state your name before question.
Hans Neuhoff, Alternative for Germany, and separatist political group in this parliament, a full member of the Committee for Security and Defense. First of all, Professor Mearsheimer, let me inform you that your approach to geopolitics makes part of our approach in the parliament and our political work, and your arguments are regularly placed in the plenary debates and in the committee debates by myself, to the effect of being labeled actually as being Radio Moscow. Now, my question is, you rightly pointed out that bringing Ukraine into NATO is neither interest of the United States nor of the European Union. Nevertheless, it happened. So what, according to you, are the truly driving forces behind this process?
Yeah.
Jonathan Hassan has written a book entitled Hubris. That's his answer. What is your answer?
Yeah, it was hubris to some extent, but that doesn't go deep enough. NATO expansion became a serious issue when Bill Clinton moved into the White House. Bill Clinton won the election in '92, and he moved into the White House in January '93. And I believe the decision to expand NATO was finally made in late 1994, okay? And the first tranche of expansion was in 1999. That's when Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary come in. And then the second big tranche was 2004. Now, it's very important to understand two things. One is that Russia was remarkably weak in the 1990s and even in the early 2000s. Vladimir Putin resurrected the Russians from the dead. So you want to understand that when we started NATO expansion in the 90s, it was not designed to contain Russia. Given the world that we live in today, I'm sure lots of people think that NATO expansion, when it started in 1994, was designed to contain Russia, that Russia was seen as a threat. That is not true. What was driving NATO expansion, this gets to my second point, is that we were the unipole. We were the only great power on the planet. And you all understand, in a world where we're the only great power on the planet, there is no great power politics because there's only one great power. So for the first time in our history, we were in a position to pursue a liberal foreign policy. And we pursued a policy that many people call liberal hegemony. We pursued a foreign policy that was designed to remake the world in America's image. And the Europeans went along with us. They were our sidekicks in this enterprise. You want to understand, I talked about the Chinese threat today. We helped create that threat because we helped China to grow more and more powerful economically. And a realist like me said at the time, China is going to translate that economic power into military power, and it's going to try to dominate East Asia to the disadvantage of the United States. Virtually everybody I talked to said, John, you are a dinosaur. Your realist view of international politics is outdated. We live in a new world. China's going to grow economically. It's going to get hooked on capitalism. It's going to get integrated into institutions like the WTO. It's eventually going to turn into a liberal democracy like the Asian tigers did. And we're going to live happily ever after because China's going to look like us and we're the good guys. And if they look like us, the world is filled with good guys. We live happily ever after. That was the belief. That was liberal hegemony applied to China. Now, how does that apply to NATO expansion? What we were doing with NATO expansion, it's a liberal policy. It's not designed to contain Russia. We're taking those institutions like NATO and the EU, and we're expanding or enlarging those institutions. We're moving them eastward, bringing in new members. They will become responsible stakeholders. Furthermore, we're making sure they're all hooked on capitalism, right? Making them economically interdependent. And if everybody's economically interdependent, nobody's going to fight because who would want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? You know, the whole argument. So institutions are spreading eastward. Economic interdependence is spreading eastward. And then, very importantly, the Velvet Revolutions, right, or the color revolutions, the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution. We're going to promote revolutions in Eastern Europe that are designed to turn those countries into pro-Western liberal democracies. And if you create a world that's filled with liberal democracies, you live happily ever after. For many of the younger people in the audience, you're going to think this is hard to believe because in 2025 it makes no sense. But I just want to say a word or two about Frank Fukuyama's very famous article, The End of History, which you should all go read if you haven't read it. It's a terribly important argument because it is the software that was in the heads of European elites and American elites and is still in the heads of many European and American elites. Frank Fukuyama's argument was that liberal democracy is the future. We liberal democracies have the wind at our back, and there are going to be more and more liberal democracies around the world. And the end result is peace. And in fact, he says at the end of the article that the biggest problem we face going forward is boredom. Boredom. Just think about that. War's off the table. And it's an argument for creating democracy, spreading institutions, and spreading capitalism and fostering economic interdependence. That's what was motivating us. We were not interested in screwing the Russians. Clinton and company in the 90s understood that the Russians were going to protest. There's no question about that. Lots of the planning documents are now available. The Clinton people understood that the Russians were adamantly opposed, but they thought they could buy the Russians off because they thought we were a benign hegemon, right? That's what they thought was going on here. And by the way, just on talking about the color revolutions, we wanted to spread a color revolution to Russia as well. There's an article in the New Yorker about Mike McFaul, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, as I was telling you before, at the time of when the Ukraine crisis broke out in 2014. But you should read, you can Google it, the New Yorker article on Mike McFaul. He was basically trying to foster a color revolution inside of Russia when he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. Needless to say, this made the Russians super angry, and they insisted that he be withdrawn as ambassador. Right. But it just gives you a sense of what's going on here. So it was the fact that we had this deeply embedded liberal foreign policy that got this train out of the station. And it covered the first tranche, 99, the second tranche, 2004. And then it was impossible to stop. Once NATO expansion started, it was just impossible to stop. And it's quite amazing that nobody in the West, except for maybe Trump on occasion, says no more NATO expansion, right? Europeans ought to be saying at this point in time, we've had enough NATO expansion. This has led to enough trouble. We have got to get our house in order. The last thing we want to do is keep provoking the Russians because it's not going to work to our benefit here in Europe. But nobody says that, or I shouldn't say nobody. Hardly anybody says that. That's certainly not the mainstream view. So I think it's the pursuit of a liberal foreign policy. And by the way, just one more point on this. I talked about engagement with China, how foolish that was. That's liberal hegemony. Second example, expansion of NATO, expansion of the EU, color revolutions, Eastern Europe. That's the second example. The third example is the Middle East, the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine was all about democratizing the Middle East. Again, most people have forgot that. We thought we were going to go into Iraq, knock Iraq off, then, well, maybe we'll do Syria, maybe we'll do Iran next, go in, knock that regime off, going to turn it into a liberal democracy, right? You know, it didn't work out. None of this worked out. The Bush Doctrine, it failed. It crashed and burned in Iraq. China, we created a peer competitor. I'm not sure it's a peer competitor. It may surpass us at one point in the not too distant future, right? And then the whole subject of NATO expansion. This was a thoroughly liberal foreign policy, and it comes out of unipolarity. It comes out of the fact, again, once you go to a world where you have one great power politics by definition is taken off the table. That means that people like me, realists who think of the world in balance of power terms, are going to be put in the closet, they're going to lock the door and keep me there. And the liberals are going to dominate, right? Which is exactly what happened. And now the world has changed. This is the transition, which I think was reflected in Tom's comments and in John's presentation. Going from unipolarity to multipolarity really matters. And that's the world we're in, and it's not going away.
Okay, next question.
Thank you, Professor. It's a real pleasure to hear from you. I was a professor of international relations at the Portuguese University for 20 years, almost 20 years. So I spent part of my life reading your books and your articles, and Kenneth Walt's books and articles, and Hans Morgenthau and others. So it's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
But allow me to in a humble and respectful way, to put in question your main argument using your own theory.
Yeah, please do.
I will use offensive realism, and you are the father of offensive realism, not to put in question, but to think about your argument. So your main argument is the Ukrainian war is NATO fault. So using offensive realism, I think that's what it was what NATO did after the end of the Cold War. So NATO took advantage of the victory in the war, of Russia's weakness, to enlarge to Eastern Europe. So it makes sense. In offensive realism perspective, it's rational. And they use the power they have, or NATO used the power they have, to enlarge using the Russian weakness to enlarge to Eastern Europe. And doing that, they use power in a way to enlarge their goals, but also to, and I think you said that containment is not a good concept to explain what happened, but deterrence is. And even you wrote that in an article about the nuclear arms, Ukrainian nuclear arms as an important way to contain, to deterrence of Russia. So in trying to be more simple, I'm not sure if it's because Ukraine is near to NATO that the war started, but because Ukraine is not in NATO. Because if it was in NATO, like the Baltic states or the others, we don't see that in the Baltic states. So I'm not sure, of course, I'm just reflecting about this issue, but I think if the problem is that we will not go to until the end, because if they were in NATO, I'm not sure if Russia will do what they did. So the question for you is, do you think that the thought of the beginning of the Ukrainian war is not because NATO enlargement, but because NATO didn't enlarge enough?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. 3 points. I think there's no question if Ukraine was in NATO that the Russians would not have invaded. But Ukraine was not in NATO. Second point is, I don't know how many of you know this, but I wrote a piece in 1993, it was in Foreign Affairs, that said Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons. I don't know how many of you know this, but when the Soviet Union broke apart, four of the new countries had nuclear weapons: Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. Belarus and Kazakhstan gave up their nuclear weapons, but Ukraine gave a lot of thought to keeping their nuclear weapons. And I wrote a piece that said Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons because it might need them for a rainy day when the Russians came knocking. Of course, apropos my response to this gentleman here, everybody thought that I was crazy, right? And Bill Clinton in particular has recently said that, and he, of course, Bill Clinton was responsible for making the Ukrainians give up their nuclear weapons. He said that he made a mistake, Clinton did, forcing Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. But I want to deal with the heart and soul of your question, which is directly opposite the argument that this gentleman made, right? Or at least my response to this gentleman. What you're saying is that NATO expansion may have caused the war, but it was done according to the dictates of my theory. NATO expansion is consistent with my theory. It wasn't a liberal foreign policy, as I said to this gentleman, as he's saying. And a number of people make this argument, by the way, and they say that I should adopt this argument because it makes my theory more powerful. I'm conceding to you that my theory didn't really matter. They locked me in the closet. He's saying, no, they acted according to your theory. Let me just make a couple points. One is, my theory says that you can only be a regional hegemon, right? You cannot be a global hegemon. But in other regions of the world, all you want to do is make sure there's no other regional hegemon. That's my Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union argument, okay? And Russia in the 1990s was not a potential regional hegemon. And as you know, I said today, it's not a potential regional hegemon. It's just too weak, right? So according to a strict interpretation of my theory, we actually should have gotten out of Europe, okay? Because there's no potential regional hegemon. We were Godzilla, we could go home. That's point one. But point two is, My theory says states should maximize their relative power. And it's a theory that says you should take advantage of other states at every turn. The name of the game in a system where there's no higher authority and you have to take care of yourself is to be as powerful as possible. And therefore, you look to take advantage of other sides. This is consistent with what you're saying. But it doesn't call for doing stupid things. And one could argue, even let's say my theory applies. We're looking for opportunities. Russia's weak. Let's begin to push. The problem that you face is that there's going to be a blowback. Now, the counter to that is we got away with the first tranche, 1999. We got away with it. We got away with the second tranche, was 2004. But then comes 2008. That's the Bucharest decision. The argument would be, if you're really smart, stop there. You've gotten really quite far, right? Two big tranches of expansion, right? Ukraine and Georgia, it's a bridge too far, or two bridges too far. And you all understand the April 2008 decision said, bring in Ukraine, bring in Georgia. And in August of 2008, there was a war over Georgia, right? That should have been the first harbinger of trouble coming on Ukraine. And you could say a good offensive realist like me should have pushed NATO expansion, right? But should have been well aware that, you're feeling your way around in the dark, but when you run into resistance, stop there. But again, my argument is that there's no potential hegemon, therefore no need to really contain the Russians. Okay, second.
Thank you very much, Professor Mearsheimer, for the fantastic speech. My name is Peter Byström, and I represent the strongest party in Germany, the AfD. And I think I speak also for many of my colleagues who are here in high number from the ESM group if I say thank you very much, Tom, thank you very much, Andreas, from the Patriots Foundation that you organized this fantastic event. I can remember seeing side event in the European Parliament this full, people standing because they have no places. Obviously, you invited a rock star. Thank you very much for that. Professor Mearsheimer, the question, you name all the negative consequences of the war. You said also that the US were very aware of what is coming when the war will start. But you didn't say who really profit of this war. We are in a situation, people saying like, the US, they caused this war, but I don't think this is in the interest of the United States of America, or the people living in the United States of America. So who are the groups who are really profiting of it? Is it the military complex? Is it the NATO? You remember that Macron said the NATO is brain dead. So does the NATO need a new enemy to justify its existence? Or is it the military complex who needs new contracts? So name the elephant in the room. So who is profiting out of this?
Yeah. Well, let me just say a few more words about how I see it developing, the conflict. 2008 is the decision to bring Ukraine into NATO, okay? And the Georgia war happens a few months later. We don't back off. We continue to push and push. And then the crisis breaks out in February 2014, okay? That's when the Ukraine crisis breaks out. The crisis starts in 2014. The war is 8 years later, 2022, February 2014. Okay, what's going on here all along is that we think we can shove NATO expansion down their throat. We think that they complained, the Russians complained bitterly about the 99 tranche, they complained bitterly about the 2004 tranche, but we just pushed it down their throat. We think that that's what we'll do in 2008, okay? And then when the crisis breaks out in 2014, we don't back off, right? Between 2008 and 2014, when the crisis breaks out, and the 8 years in between when the war breaks out, we don't back off. And as I said to you in my formal comments, what's really amazing is the Americans who are saying that war is likely before it happens, before February 24th, 2022. The Americans are saying loudly and clearly, war is going to break out. Putin's going to invade Ukraine. And the Americans are complaining that the Ukrainians won't take that argument seriously. Yet we do nothing. We do nothing to prevent the war. No diplomacy. And then when the war starts, we are the ones who encourage the Ukrainians to walk away. So you say to yourself, what's going on here, right? Really, what's happening? We thought we could defeat the Russians. As I said, that's why we didn't back off. So I think what's happening here is that when Putin comes to power in 2000, all right, and you ramp forward up to 2014, certainly up to 2022, the Russians are beginning to contest the West in really serious ways over that time period. The first big piece of evidence of how angry Putin is at us is the annual security conference in Munich, 2007. Go back and read Putin's speech, 2007. Then 2008 is the NATO decision on Georgia and Ukraine, and then you get the Georgia war in 2008, then you get the crisis in 2014. Now, nobody thought that we were going to get a war. That's too strong. The people who were pushing this train down the tracks did not think we were going to get a war. And then when they thought they'd get a war, they thought we would win like that. And I think that it wasn't like the military-industrial complex was pushing it, or there were sort of a set of economic or political incentives to do that. The United States is filled with people who believe in the mailed fist. And they believe that the United States is an incredibly powerful country that can use its mailed fist to get its way. This is especially true of the neoconservatives, who are a very powerful element in the decision-making process in the United States. This is why we didn't back off, right? We just thought we would win, and it would be relatively cost-free. And from an American point of view, by 2022, remember, we're in a multipolar world. Just think about this. We're in a multipolar world starting about 2017. So the Ukraine crisis breaks out in 2014. That's in the unipolar world. The war is 2022. By the time the war comes, Russia's now a great power. Putin has resurrected it from the dead. So what we think we can do is we could defeat the Russians and knock them out of the ranks of the great powers. That's our basic thinking at the time. And the Europeans go along with this. The Europeans used to offer resistance to the Americans. When I was young, there were people like Helmut Schmidt, who was a real tough cookie, as my mother would say, and he'd stand up to the Americans. You all remember Charles de Gaulle, and there were all sorts of other leaders, either Konrad Adenauer and so forth and so on. The Europeans were willing to argue with the Americans, to put up resistance. And this was true even in the Iraq War in 2003, as I'm sure you remember. The French and the Germans were opposed to the Iraq War. But something happened after that, and the Europeans reached a point where they were just incapable of putting up any resistance to the Americans, and in fact, they became cheerleaders. So when it came to, the 2008 decision and what happens moving forward, the Europeans just went along with the Americans, and the Americans are addicted to war. You all understand the United States is addicted to war. We believe that the mailed fist can solve almost every problem. This is like the Israelis. The Israelis and the Americans, they don't believe that there's a political problem out there that can't be solved with military force. My view is most political problems can only be solved with a heavy dose of a political settlement or political calculations, not just military calculations. But I think that that's basically what drove the train here. The belief that we could get away with it. There was going to be no costs. right? Just benefits, and that didn't turn out to be the case. As I said in the very beginning, I think most Europeans had no idea we would be where we are today. Certainly in the 1990s, but even in the run-up to the Ukraine war, right? There's nobody, I shouldn't say there's nobody, there's hardly anybody who was saying, oh my God, you know, this is a disastrous decision. We're going to get ourselves in real trouble.